Hello again, students. We're going to continue looking at post-World War II United States by focusing on the Second Red Scare. This, along with McCarthyism, which is an associated phenomena, is a reflection of the Cold War fears in American society. So we're looking at how containment and this concern about the Soviet Union, communism in general, and really just some anxiety about America's precarious position at the top of the world after World War II is affecting society at home. In short, we're going to run into a second Red Scare. If you recall, when we examined the 1920s, there was a first Red Scare around 1919-1920 in response to the Russian Revolution of 1917, where the communists overthrew the Tsar and implemented the first communist government in the world. And this one got tied up in our fears and concerns about immigration in the first Red Scare. If you'll recall, the concern was that immigrants were bringing in these radical ideas and that they were going to try to overthrow the American government as they had done in the Soviet Union, or as Russians had done in the Soviet Union. The second Red Scare is a little bit less concerned with communism outside of the U.S. and more of a fear that communism is in the U.S. It's much more of a sense of paranoia and conspiracy that goes on with it. There's the idea that communists are everywhere, in the government, in the army, in the media, in the workplace, in the unions, just all over the place. And we need to watch out for them because they're secretly trying to overthrow the government. In both cases, these are largely reactions to or persecutions of radical left-wing ideas like anarchism, communism, and even socialism, which is somewhat less radical than the other two. So what are some of the things contributing to the resurgence of this Red Scare, this fear in the United States? One is the general tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union as enveloped in the arms race and this idea of mad, mutually assured destruction that starts to develop over the course of the next couple of decades. The United States becomes not the only nation to have atomic weapons after 1949 when the Soviet Union tests their first atomic bomb. The U.S. ups the ante with the hydrogen bomb in 1952, and then in 1953 the Soviet Union detonates their own hydrogen bomb. So there's this sort of constant fear that a lot of people live under that you could be blown up at any time. And as the weapons and the delivery systems become more sophisticated and more capable, that sort of pervasive sense of fear is always going to be there underlying American society, creating a lot of tension. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite into space, this added fears to the United States. Number one, that this rocket program could be used to deliver nuclear warheads, which both the United States and the Soviet Union will in the future do, and also fear maybe they might be putting nukes in space, but also a sort of general sense that we're falling behind, right? They have reached space and we haven't done that. And then lastly, internationally, what's going on with communism? Communism seemed to be on the march in many Americans' minds. And remember, a lot of American officials even looked at communism as one singular group and not, separate nations adopting the same or similar government types. So there was this sense that communism was winning. Control of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union after World War II, China falling to communism, and then, of course, the Korean War are all going to add to this sort of overarching tension in American society. Now, add to this fear that there were, in fact, spies for the Soviet Union in the United States. And, of course, the United States had spies in the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of that going on during the Cold War. But what was especially concerning for Americans was some very high-profile domestic spying cases, American citizens working with the Soviet Union. One of these is going to be a man named Alger Hiss, Harvard-educated, top rung of American society, one of the architects of the New Deal, high level in the State Department in the late 40s. And he is accused of passing confidential government documents on to a communist agent. That agent was a man named Whittaker Chambers, who had been a communist, but then, like many American communists, became disillusioned with the idea of communism when he saw how it worked out in Stalinist Russia, that descent into totalitarianism and cult of personality. And so he had renounced this and was testifying before Congress in the House Un-American Activities Committee, which we'll get to in a moment. And he gave up Alger Hiss's name. So Hiss was called before Congress. He denied this, but his story starts to unravel over time. Whittaker is able to present some evidence of this, and eventually, Hiss is convicted of perjury, lying to Congress, and sentenced to 5 years. The two people we see on the screen here are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a married couple who were convicted of passing nuclear secrets to a Soviet agent. So they had some workings with the U.S. Atomic Energy Agency and passed some of that information on there. Their case was based largely on the word of another convicted spy, a guy named Klaus Fuchs, which is kind of a shaky position to be in. The fact that the Rosenbergs were Jewish, too, was seen and was claimed by them to be the reason that they were being persecuted. And they will, throughout, maintain their innocence and refuse to name anybody else who may be who was a spy working with them. And they were both sentenced to death, still refused to give away any other names, and were both executed. Now, the convictions of both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and Alger Hiss were pretty controversial at the time. There were many people taking up their cause, but later in 1995, the CIA will release some classified papers after the fall of the Soviet Union called the Venona Papers, and both of them, it seems to indicate that in both cases, they were in fact Soviet agents. So all of this fear of communism abroad being on the march, the U.S. may be falling behind against them as the enemy, coupled with domestic spying cases where we are finding actual Soviet agents within the U.S., is going to lead the government to take a lot of actions that are challenging to civil liberties, to say the least. Overall, they're going to use something called the Smith Act, and this was a law that made it illegal to teach or advocate the violent overthrow of the United States government. This was passed in 1940, right before World War II. And they use this, the government uses this to attack the American Communist Party, because there is a Communist Party in the United States. There's nothing illegal about being a communist. But despite the fact that the American Communist Party specifically said in their platform they do not advocate the violent overthrow of the government, the Smith Act was used basically to go after communists and paint them all as being advocates of the overthrow of the government. President Truman will create the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, authorizing the government to basically screen all of federal employees for any signs of political disloyalty. It finds exactly 0, although many people are forced out under suspicion, even though nothing is ever proven. People are going to be blacklisted if they are members of what were classified as subversive organizations. They could end up having their name on a list and they couldn't find work, especially in the government, but in other fields as well. The House Un-American Activities Committee, which we see being protested by American citizens here, or HUAC, was originally formed in 1938 to investigate possible subversives, Nazis, fascists, or communists in the United States. And this is all, of course, in that lead up to the U.S. involvement in World War II. Now, after World War II, HUAC now is left basically being concerned with communists. And they start holding some highly publicized hearings investigating members of the government, the armed forces, unions, educators, media, and other areas for communist activity. And just being called before HUAC was oftentimes enough to tarnish your reputation that you were suspected of being a communist. A group of Hollywood writers, producers, and directors, very famously known as the Hollywood 10, refused to testify before HUAC, citing their Fifth Amendment rights. Some of them had been members of the Communist Party, maybe were members of the Communist Party, but again, nothing illegal about that. But they refused to give testimony because of that, and because HUAC oftentimes would ask them to name names, kind of like in the Salem witch hunt, who else was a witch with you kind of thing. And they didn't want to be forced to point the finger at anybody that they knew. They were all convicted of contempt of Congress, and some spent about a year in jail and were fined, but more importantly, they were all blacklisted, and Hollywood started to develop its own blacklist of people not to hire. And this is all going to heighten tensions as people start looking everywhere for communists in American society. On the Senate side of things, Senator Joseph McCarthy, seen here presenting some BS he made up, is going to use the Red Scare to further his political career, to further his power, and in the process heighten those fears even more. McCarthy is a venerable liar. He just makes things up all the time. Very unethical kind of guy, really looking to push himself forward. He was a one-term senator from Minnesota when he was, Wisconsin, when he was looking sort of for a way, I think, to keep his name in the news. And so he comes out and claims he has a list of names of known communists within the United States State Department, the people who conduct all of our diplomacy and foreign affairs. But he never produces any of those specific names. He just claims to have names. And then later, when pushed on it, he says, well, most of them are just suspicious people, but some of them are actual communists. But we never ever see those names because they didn't exist. He starts holding hearings in the Senate. He's accusing people of being communists without any sort of evidence of that. He badgers witnesses, he gets people to name names, and does all these things. And he becomes so powerful that he is feared by other members of Congress. They don't dare cross McCarthy because he might accuse them of being a communist, and people would believe him, and it would blacklist people from that. And all of this is undermining some legitimate concerns about communism in the U.S. and about potential subversives. But, at the same time, you've got this guy just making crap up, and our attention is drawn elsewhere. Not unlike some groups today, claiming to look out for child trafficking rings and stuff like that, who interfere with the actual investigations for these. What brings McCarthy down is he goes after the United States Army, and they do it in a televised hearing. So the American people see what McCarthy is doing. They see his tactics. They see him bullying people. They see him going after innocent people without any sort of evidence and just ruining reputations right there on TV. And he's going after the Army, of all things, just shortly after World War II. And this eventually, the public turns on him. He loses any support that he had. The Senate ends up censoring him. And this really sort of marks the beginning of the end for the Red Scare as it starts to decline in front of this. But this also shows the power of television media in United States politics. When we can see things going on, it becomes much more visceral and more affecting than just reading about it. And in this case, television did a good thing and brought down a very bad actor in American government. Looking at the graphic organizer for this, the 4 things across the top are all things that led to the Red Scare. The 4 at the bottom are all things that came about as a result of or were affected by the Red Scare. So I want you to explain to me either how it led to the Red Scare or how it was a result of it. So, for example, mutually assured destruction led to many of us being afraid of being blown up. And that made us all scared of everything, including commies. I love you. Bye-bye.